Hello, everyone. My name is Roberto Bottazzi. I teach at the Bartlett here in London, and I have put together some notes on the history of the relationship between data and architecture. All right, so first of all, thanks to you all, and particularly to Vera, for this opportunity to continue our conversations on topics that are of interest to both of us. I would like to perhaps very quickly introduce myself first. As I said, I teach at the Bartlett, where I direct the Master in Urban Design, and where I discuss the relationship between data and architecture on a variety of levels, both in terms of the history and theory, which is the main subject of this particular presentation, but also in terms of design, the implication of data in design, and therefore more projective role of data in computation in how architecture and cities will look like in the future. We do it by meshing different technologies, but mostly operating always at the large scale. This is something that it is of an interest of mine, let's say the large dimension. I don't need to spend a lot of time to make a case for why data are relevant now. We all see it everywhere in the mainstream press or any other media that we consult, and particularly big data, that would be particularly large data sets are becoming a key ingredient of the culture we live in. I would also add the algorithms that are required to mine and order these data sets as to be now part of one continuum. But I also think that is perhaps worthy problematizing this notion of data, and therefore sort of expanding it beyond the immediate use that we make of data, and beyond the immediate, if you like, technical concerns, right? So I suppose I will try to do a little bit of this throughout this presentation, and I will increasingly move from examples that are more direct and more almost, if you like, technical, to ones that are more culturally charged and if you like, more even rhetorical, right? Data, of course, means, like I said, working with machines. And when we work with machines, perhaps, I always find interesting to refer back to this summary of Leibniz sort of thoughts on machines that was provided by Goldstein. And this kind of, there are 2 points here that are interesting. I think that one thing is that the role of machines is always, or at least in Leibniz views, was that of understanding the inhuman qualities of calculation. That is a very interesting idea, that somehow there's a domain that is beyond human understanding, and that can be articulated, apprehended through machines. And the second one is, of course, that machines are not simply instruments of efficiency, but also instruments of speculation. That is, the fourth point here alludes to the idea that machines could be used for testing hypothetical conditions, and speculate about future conditions. I also think that the part of, to problematize the issue, we have to think more carefully about the role of theory, the role of intellectual framing of this conversation, which, again, another historical examples was already very clear at a time where perhaps the actual technical devices to store data were not particularly powerful. But here you can see in the quote that is made very clear that what will make the difference will be intellect, will be the theoretical position to work with. So if we go from pragmatic to more rhetorical, We have to first say that by big data, we normally understand the data sets that possess these three categories, yeah, which are fairly self-explanatory. Maybe granularity is the only one that is not perhaps immediately graspable, and refers, of course, to the scaling and to the dimensionality of the data, to the high dimensionality of data. But I think it's also more interesting to, like I said, to push beyond the strictly technical and the strictly pragmatic, to understand that by working with data, we have been able to see things differently. And data could be part of a long trajectory of technical instruments we have conceived in order to overcome, if you like, to see more, and to expand the domains of what is becomes amenable to our manipulation, if you like. And the climate change is one of these things. Yeah, is one of the things that data have made visible. Data here has to be understood in conjunction with the net computational powers able to make sense or work with data. And of course, I'm aware that computation here plays also another role, that is of consuming vast amounts of energy to propel this new ways of seeing. But we can see, of course, things that are incredibly large, things that are incredibly granular and small. In other words, we are becoming we've been enabled to access domains that perhaps we could not fully grasp before. And the data, of course, allows us to also work at scales that in architecture or urban or even urban design were not accessible before. And it allows us to work with it in a systematic way, in a way that allows a certain degree of structure, though still quite open. Some of these thoughts were the ideas that were kind of underpinning my investigation into this topic, which ended up becoming a book, in which I wanted to study, let's say, these problems beyond the strictly technical domain of, let's say, manuals, and also beyond perhaps a very loose kind of treatment that had no real engagement with the technology itself. So for that reason, I made the book and I divided it into 8 chapters, each one of them that sort of discussed a particular aspect of the ecology of digital machines, and in a way that made evident that conversations on these particular topics, like databases, on things like that, were largely preceding the invention of the digital computer, the actual machine. And by looking at a much larger kind of domain, it was possible to see kind of certain figures, or I should call them perhaps paradigms, that were coming and going or evolving in and allowing for a relationship between design or architecture, more precisely, and computation. It was a journey that also tried to go beyond certain narratives that had to do with chronological discussion, which I felt was limiting, and also typological one, in the sense that in architecture, of course, you may know that typology is a very loaded word, and I wanted to offer a more lateral, a more kind of open way to discuss these topics, and the 8 chapters are the answer to that kind of particular problem. So going from more pragmatic to more rhetorical understanding of the subject, I thought it's still useful to quickly look at the various domains in which we define information, or let's say the increased amount of hierarchy that we have as we move from data to knowledge. Yeah, but when we are dealing with computers, although this lecture is titled Data Architecture, is perhaps more correctly understood as information. Yeah? In fact, we have the fields informatics as a proper discipline. Because of course computers require information to be formatted to a certain degree in order to be legible by machines. So this domain of information, of course, finds its center in the notion of the database. Again, a terminology that is strictly linked to digital computer, but predates it in other kind of form of organization of knowledge, such as the dictionary or the catalog. But nevertheless, the database is core technology of computation, and the database has at least two characteristics that I think are useful to foreground to use for in our little journey, right? The idea of hierarchy, of how is the data structured, and the idea of retrieval. How could it be searched? How do we navigate in it? And these two characteristics could be called the form as a form of the database, of course, not form as in architectural form. And it takes a number of different configurations according to the technology. So I would like to go more towards this kind of the relationship with space and architecture. And like I said, I want to do it in a way that is more direct and gets more and more nuanced as we move. So I have three examples of direct correlation between data and architecture. And I want to do it in a way that is not necessarily chronological, and it's not necessarily strictly bound to the presence of the digital computer. So the first one is the examples coming from military architecture, and particularly the architecture of fortifications, right? Of bastions, of walls that protect parts of the city or the whole of the city, in fact. And this is a great example of, I think, data architecture, very literal, because the morphology, the articulation, the distribution of openings in a piece of military architecture is a direct consequence of these dotted lines, yeah? The lines that describe the ballistic trajectories of the weaponry used by the opposing army. And you will not find any treaty on military architecture that does not have these lines. Here is Michelangelo's own drawings on military of his experiments on military architecture, and we have very clearly here again all these red lines that show how directly data and form come into some kind of resonance with one another, a very direct one in this case. And of course, there's also an incredible control of morphologies here that we see in Michelangelo's drawing. But anyway, in this particular conversation, of course, like I said, this is also scalable, has a possibility to become an entire city in itself, not just a piece of architecture. The second direct kind of example is the library. The library, because of course, in the library, the ordering, the classification system of how the books are organized has a direct impact on the actual morphology of the architecture. And in a way, you could say that the two figures of the retrieval and hierarchy are directly informing the architectural piece, and more, you can even go beyond that and say that architecture itself plays a computational role in performing these two tasks in space. And again, classification systems have a very long history themselves. The Dewey system, which of course has also a rhetorical quality, as in takes us from the heavens to the earth as we move through the various numbers of the classification system. The the Dewey system has informed every piece of architecture, every library, sorry, that we have, and even more recent examples show very clearly this relationship. At urban level, also between the early and more mature Renaissance, we have actually from medieval times to the Renaissance, we have a proliferation of so-called memory palaces. Memory palaces, of course, were already being described in antiquity, so they were not really a ex nihilo invention of the Renaissance, but nevertheless, they had a great popularity in the Renaissance too. And it's using, again, architecture as a computational device in the sense that these are devices to memorize complex arguments or complex lists of objects. They were particularly useful for doctors, they were particularly useful for lawyers, and they operated in a way in which you would construct an imaginary piece of architecture, say a palace, and place particular objects in each room of the palace. Now, the object had a certain symbolic meaning that would trigger a set of notions that was attached to it. So by walking, if you like, from room to room in this imaginary building, a doctor or a lawyer could have reconstructed, could have memorized and again reconstructed complex arguments, for instance, in the case of a lawyer. Again, hierarchy and retrieval system at work. And you could do it for a city too. Yeah? Again, you could have done it for the entire layout of the city. And it's a very interesting also use, again, of architecture as a computational machine, but also of a certain organization of space as a direct consequence of data. I want to show you two examples that will take us further into more complex relationship between data and architecture. And the first one is the theater by Giulio Camilo, a project that Camilo worked on throughout his life. And the Idea del Teatro, which is the book that explains how the theater works, was published in 1540. That basically shortly before Giulio Camilo passed away. And what is this theater? Well, the theater is a piece of architecture that should contain all the knowledge of the time. And by virtue of its own organization, should contribute to the emergence of new knowledge. So it's a complete repository that is organized in such a way that new ideas should emerge from it. So let's look at how it's organized. So we have, again, hierarchy and retrieval. The organization is based on a grid. The grid is a 7x7 grid, and it has a symbolic ordering based on planets or known planets at the time, identifying the columns, whereas the gates or the distinctions, which are again figures of deities, organize the rows of the theater. In the end, of course, the final configuration is actually remapped onto the architecture of the classic theater, so on a sort of half hemisphere, and the different kinds of knowledge is now possible to be placed based on the structure of the grid. This is a drawing of Francis Yates, and you can course, read more about the theater in her work on the memory palaces. But what I want to say here are a number of things that are quite interesting. First of all, obviously, it's an inversion of a traditional theater. The users of the theater must be on stage, and knowledge must unfold before their eyes, as if knowledge was sitting on the various seats of the theater. So Magnamente extra nos is how Giulio Camilo describes this theater, like a great mind outside ourselves. And it's a totalizing view of classical knowledge, of knowledge that has been stabilized enough to be part of the theater. It's also a system that uses topical logic as a retrieval device. So there's an identification between space and knowledge through the topical logic. And it's also an automatic, if you like, is an automatic system for the organization of knowledge. Yeah? New knowledge, if new knowledge was to be inserted through the hierarchy system put in place by Giulio Camilo, this would be possible to locate it precisely. So it's also a kind of creative machine in that sense. I want to say a few more things. First of all, perhaps more kind of literal, more factual, but still useful. The theater was never built. We know that the wooden models of it existed, but they did not survive. They were destroyed, and therefore, all we know is the verbal description that is in Camilo's book, and these drawings were based on it. The other thing that we do know is, of course, that each seat should have been occupied by a chest of drawers, in front of which a panel was representing the knowledge in that particular location. And we know that 201 panels had been commissioned to Titian, the Venetian painter. We are in Venice, by the way. Giulio Camilo spent most of his life in Venice, and then later on in France. These 201 panels made this theater also, if you like, if you want to use more contemporary language, also a multimedia environment, right, in which different kind of senses were helping the mind to navigate knowledge and to reconstruct it in a way that was novel, innovative. The actual seats had a special design for the drawers that were meant to organize knowledge. And inside the drawers, there was a special design for the books that had particular tabs to facilitate navigation. So it's a quite sophisticated system, but again, it's a system that uses architecture directly to resonate with data. I'm using a contemporary word to describe something that, of course, is not strictly speaking data, but nevertheless, as a very interesting idea, and humans too become part of this kind of machine, if you like, because it's actually the movement of humans from the stage to the seats or between the seats that traces a different section, if you like, a new trajectory between existing knowledge. Yeah? So this machine, as such, of course, Giulio Camilo was particularly good at selling his ideas, was sold as the ultimate kind of machine towards originality, for being original. I also want to say a few things about Sebastiano Serlio, because Serlio was Camilo's good friend, and we know that the 7 books of architecture were 7 because, of course, the grid of the theater was a 7x7 grid. So, in the structuring of this knowledge, there is there are points of contact with architecture or architects which are more than one. And I also think it's a very interesting idea of how, if you like, a certain degree of openness is left to how this object is navigated, right? So as you can sense, there's a lot more than technicalities at play in this sort of ideas. And yet we have ideas that we carry with us as we attempt to make similar operation with computers now. Now, like I said, it's not really worth discussing the history of computation chronologically. And therefore, I will make a colossal jump forward to identify another, I think, paradigmatic moment in the relationship between data and space. This takes us to last century, in fact, around 1915 and 1920 in Germany first, and then London afterwards, as we discuss the work of Aby Warburg, right? So Warburg, the Warburg Institute is here in London now, but of course it was not founded here in London. It was in Hamburg, and then when the political climate in Germany was not really that great anymore, the archive was moved to London. Warburg, this is the archive now, but what I want to talk about is the Nemouzine Project, which is the project that Warburg worked on towards the end of his life, left unfinished. Again, it's a project that it's hardly to finish anyway, but he left it unfinished. And it's also useful to speak of Warburg. His institute has a library that has a unique classification system. So Warburg, of course, did not classify books according to the subject of the book, but tried literally to create networks between books. So physically. So if you visit this library, if you have a book placed in a certain shelf, the book adjacent to that book have some kind of connections with it that were, of course, designed by Warburg himself. And in a way, the library was not meant to be a library open to the public. It was his own personal library. So in a way, it's a library conceived for one user only. And I think theoretically, this library would require its archive to be constantly readjusted as new books or even existing books change the position. Yeah, because it's literally a network of association between books. So obviously very hard to navigate, but nevertheless as a very interesting classification system, which of course immediately resonates with the internet, with how documents can be linked or organized digitally. But the Nemouzine Atlas, it's a project that is conceptually close to the library, but factually distinct, and it's an idea to create a, let's say, I will describe this more from the point of view of this lecture, right? So I don't want to be I don't want to adhere too tightly to the strict description of the Nemouzine Atlas, which you can find in many other scholarly researches. But here, what I think is interesting is how to conceive a methodology to navigate through art, through history, through the iconography of art, in a way that is not necessarily immediately relying on text to operate. And the way in which the Nemouzine Warburg sort of deals with this question is by constructing all these different panels of images, all around a theme. Yeah. let's call them, again, to tie it back to what I said earlier, a paradigm in the history of art. And as such, it creates 79 of these screens. They are all on black cloth. They contain material that has a different media. So there are clippings from newspapers, reproductions of existing paintings, photographs taken by Warburg himself, and so on and so forth. It's very interesting, of course, that the navigation of this object is something that requires a certain degree of skills and literacy, but also is very open and can be constantly reconfigured. That's why I said the project was not one that could have been completed that easily. But in a way, each panel revolves around a specific element in the history of art. It could be a certain iconographic figure, for instance, and it traces it through time. But the tracing is not chronological, as you can see in this image. So it has no start, it has no center, it has not a single media that is determined to be the one through which one must study that particular issue. But it's a network. It's a learning mechanism through which we learn through experiencing it, right? Like in a labyrinth, we learn how to move from within it, and so there's no visual similarity, and it's evident somehow that there's an element of reconstruction that should have been completed by then writing a text accompanying the panel, but that didn't quite happen. So, and it's also an incredible attempt to find yet a unified way, a unified method for the study of history of art, and yet leaving it incredibly open. There are all the notes, of course, so there's also a kind of more strictly speaking archival operation behind this, and perhaps unavoidably the project became a website in 1997, somehow again using the net and the idea of the hyperlink, sorry, as a means to continue the perhaps the mode of thinking that Warburg had conceived in the 20s. So you see a very interesting idea, I think, that speaks very much about how we work with data now, because of course now we have direct manifestations of data and architecture that are also incredibly open in their organization. Yeah, the logistics of, for instance, the Amazon Fulfillment Center is one in which the information is not hierarchically controlled. The information is scattered randomly and then retrieved by means of algorithms. So this kind of architecture is very much an open network. And what architecture played in the historical examples we showed before, that is to act as a computational device to organize and retrieve data, is here substituted by algorithms that are acting almost like a sectional devices through the data to form an image which is stable enough to be used and then probably will disappear again very quickly. So these kind of spaces are completely ordered, of course. There's no object here that is misplaced. And I want to just wrap this short talk up by showing some of the more contemporary things that we think about when we operate with the data. So these are exercises that students perform, and they are called operational rewritings, and they are basically little kind of exploration of how to articulate data in space. So in a way, they are very limited. They don't attempt to become kind of overarching narratives. They are very simple. Of course, they play with space, so they have a limited domain. They don't play with other notions that are part of the design language, such as program or material. But by playing with this kind of way of using data to inform and to transform space, we hope that students acquire a certain sensibility towards the issue, an issue that you saw as is traceable in the history of the discipline for a very long period of time, and they do that by not constantly seeking the optimization as criteria for operating with computers, right? This is a mantra that you will probably hear a lot as you study the subject. So optimization is also another way to perhaps normalize data. And in a way, I think that here is a lot more about playfulness, is about how to communicate with the inhuman quality of calculation through the language of spatial articulations, which is perhaps slightly more graspable by architects. So these are playful concepts that are also engines, if you like, for search. So there's no particular, as I said, optimization is not necessarily the criteria here. So there are ways to explore and exploit data and their materiality, the ability to work with numbers almost as if they were a material itself. And these sort of things, of course, they can be further refined, but I think to me, they begin to think about what could be a degree of digital literacy at the level of design. So quite, if you like, quite, again, precise in its location, that we could begin to work on. So larger configuration, no particular issues of scale, playing in this kind of work, and therefore recuperate, if you like, or rethink some of the more culturally charged issues that we've seen in these series of case studies, if you like, that I explained. So in the end, of course, they can become also more directly architectural as through various evolutions. But I would like to conclude this talk by hoping that I've put a little bit of curiosity on the richness of this relationship between data and space, and helped you to see that through this richness, there are many different kind of narratives that can be played out and have been at work in this conversation. And I look forward to perhaps continue the conversation with you in one way or another. Thank you for your attention, and bye-bye.